ever feel like you're about to jump into a mission without, the full tactical playbook.
Happens to the best of us.
Right. That's why we're cracking open ADP 390.
Yeah.
And look, not to bore you with definitions and stuff, but to pull out those like, moments.
Those light bulb moments.
The stuff that separates just, reading doctrine from really owning the battlefield.
Absolutely. We're talking about the ideas that will actually shift your thinking as a leader. I don't care what your echelon is.
Exactly. And one of the biggest, I guess, takeaways for me going through this doctrine is the emphasis on like joint interdependence. It's easy to get siloed in our Army roles, but ADP 390 is really hammering home. We are part of a much, much larger force.
Absolutely. And thinking back to, well, I guess I can't get into specifics, but that operation it was that seamless coordination between our platoon and the Air Force assets that really, I think, made the difference for us. We were able to secure that objective with minimal casualties because we had that air cover, we had that support. It was a textbook example of joint interdependence in action.
Totally. It's easy to just kind of, gloss over it in the doctrine.
Right.
But when you see it play out.
When you lived it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It drives home that point that leveraging each other's strengths is not just some abstract idea, it's a force multiplier on the ground.
Yeah.
But knowing when and how to leverage those strengths well, that's where those 12 principles of joint operations really come into play.
Yeah, and those principles, they're not just like bureaucratic hurdles, you know what I mean? They're born from hard-won experience.
They're lessons learned.
Exactly. Take maneuver, for example. You mentioned earlier how it's more than just moving troops around.
It's not just like logistics.
Exactly. It's about using that movement to, dictate the terms of the engagement, to keep the enemy guessing.
Right, like in that campaign simulation we did, what was that, last month? Remember, when we focused too much on holding our position, we got bogged down, we got pinned down. But the team that prioritized maneuver, that used the terrain to their advantage and kept the enemy off balance, they were the ones who ultimately succeeded. It's about being proactive, not reactive.
Yes, and that's where understanding the objective, I think, really ties in, knowing what you need to achieve and then maneuvering your forces in a way that sets you up for success.
So we've got this big picture of joint operations,
Yeah.
right? But how do we actually apply these concepts, on the ground in the thick of it? And that's where I think ADP 390 gets into operational versus mission variables.
Yeah.
It could feel a little overwhelming at first, all these different factors to consider.
Oh, sure, like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? But remember, it's about having a framework for thinking. You've got your operational variables, that's your PMECIT, political, military, economic, social, information, infrastructure, physical environment, and time. That's what paints the broad strategic landscape.
Right. It's the lay of the land, so to speak.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Before you even step foot on the ground, you need to understand the political climate of the region. You need to understand the enemy's motivations, why are they doing what they're doing, the loyalties of the local population, even the terrain, the weather conditions, all of that factors in.
It's about understanding the chessboard before you make your move.
Precisely. But then you got to zoom in. You got to zoom in on the specifics of your mission, and that's where MTTTC comes in.
Okay, so break that down for us.
So METTC, mission, enemy, terrain and weather, troops and support available, time available, and civil considerations.
Okay, so you're tailoring that big picture analysis to the very specific, challenges you're facing on that mission.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going into a densely populated urban environment. Suddenly, those civil considerations, things like how do we protect non-combatants, how do we minimize collateral damage?
Yeah.
Those become paramount.
Absolutely. And the beauty of MTTC is its flexibility, Let's say your intel reveals a change in the enemy's disposition or the weather takes a turn for the worse. Well, that's going to directly impact your assessment of the terrain, your available time, potentially even the support you need. It's an iterative process, constantly evolving as you get more information.
You got to stay flexible. Got to roll with the punches.
Exactly. You've got to be able to shift gears on the fly to be comfortable operating in that gray zone where those lines blur. And that's why understanding how those 4 elements of decisive action, offense, defense, stability operations, and DSCA, or defense support of civil authorities, how those 4 elements work together, how they can be seamlessly integrated, that's crucial. That is crucial for success in any operation.
Yeah, because it's never going to be like, okay, this is purely an offensive operation.
All right, it's never that clean.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that old saying, right? No plan survives first contact with the enemy. You got to be ready to adjust, to improvise.
And to do it all while, effectively coordinating your actions, not just with your team, but with the other branches too.
Right? It's that joint fight again.
Exactly. And that's where the 6 warfighting functions come in. Think of it as the tools in the Army's toolbox.
Love that analogy. So we're not just talking about tanks and rifles here.
No, this is bigger picture stuff. These functions are about how we actually make things happen on the battlefield. And they're not just separate compartments either. They're all intertwined. They got to work together. It's like a complex machine,
Okay, I'm following. So break it down for me. What are the gears in this machine?
Yeah.
What makes it tick?
You've got command and control, which is, well, it's all in the name, right?
Right. Got to make sure everyone's on the same page.
It's the brain, the nervous system of the whole operation, ensuring everyone's got the right information, that orders are relayed clearly, up and down the chain. Without that, everything falls apart. Chaos.
Exactly. Then you've got movement and maneuver, which we talked about earlier, but this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
Right. It's one thing to talk about it, another to actually pull it off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This function, it's everything from planning routes to formations to how you're actually going to move across the terrain, all while taking into account the enemy, your capabilities. It's a lot to juggle.
And speaking of juggling, you also need to know where the enemy is, right? What they're doing, what they're planning. Which brings us to intelligence, right?
And let me tell you, good intelligence is priceless. It's not just about spotting the enemy, it's about understanding their intentions. Why are they doing what they're doing? What are their strengths, their weaknesses? It's about predicting their next move before they even make it.
So you can counter it, which is where fires comes in, I imagine, bringing the boom.
Exactly. Whether it's artillery, air support, or just good old-fashioned direct fire from our own weapons, the fire's function, it's about bringing the pain. Decisive, overwhelming firepower at the right time and place. That's what it's all about. And we can't forget about keeping our own guys supplied and in the fight. Which takes us to sustainment.
Logistics wins wars, my friend. I can't emphasize that enough. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, all of it, it's the lifeblood of any operation.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have protection. Got to look out for our own.
Absolutely, because it doesn't matter how good your offense is if you're getting hammered all the time, right?
No good.
Protection, it's everything from setting up defensive positions to camouflage, even using electronic warfare to mess with their comms. It's about minimizing our own vulnerabilities and exploiting theirs.
Smart. So we've got these 6 warfighting functions all working together, but ultimately the goal is to defeat the enemy, right?
At the end of the day, yeah.
In ADP 390, it breaks defeat down into 4 mechanisms: destroy, dislocate, disintegrate, and isolate. And these all sound kind of similar, I guess, at first glance, but they're actually quite distinct.
Very much so. Destroy is the most straightforward, I guess. You're physically eliminating the enemy. Their tanks, their artillery, their command posts, whatever it takes to make them incapable of fighting.
Okay, that's pretty clear. And what about dislocate? That seems a little less about, like, firepower and more about...
Maneuvering.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not necessarily trying to wipe them out completely with dislocate, at least not right away. It's about disrupting their plans, forcing them to react to what you're doing, not the other way around.
So you can dictate the terms of a fight.
Exactly. And once you've got them off balance, that's when you can start to think about disintegrating them, breaking down their command and control, messing with their logistics, turning their own systems against them.
To sow chaos.
Controlled chaos, preferably. And finally, you've got isolate. Cut them off from their supplies, reinforcements, their support networks. Make it impossible for them to sustain the fight.
So you're essentially, like, starving them out.
In a manner of speaking, yeah.
So I guess these defeat mechanisms, they're not mutually exclusive, right? You could be employing several of them at the same time.
Absolutely. In fact, the best commanders, they use a combination. It's about hitting the enemy from all sides on multiple levels.
Right, keep them guessing.
Keep them off balance. That's the key.
So those are like the big picture ideas, but it all comes down to tactics, right? Knowing how to execute those big ideas on the ground in real time.
And that's where those core tactical concepts in ADP 390 come into play.
Exactly. And there are a lot of them. So let's dive into a few of the key ones. Let's start with, like, areas of influence, interest, operations AI, AO, AOI. I'll admit I used to get those all mixed up.
Yeah, it can feel like alphabet soup sometimes, right?
Totally.
But knowing these distinctions, it's crucial for effective coordination. It's basic battlefield
All
geometry.
right, so help me wrap my head around it.
Okay, so your area of operations, your AO, that's your immediate battle space, right?
Right.
The area where you have the authority, the resources, the responsibility to conduct your mission.
It's your lane.
Exactly. But your influence, it extends beyond your immediate area of operations. That's where area of influence comes in, your AI. This
Yeah.
is the broader region where you can have an impact even if you don't have boots on the ground there.
So you might use artillery strikes, air strikes, things like that to influence what's going on.
Exactly. Shaping the battlefield even if you're not directly engaged. And then even further out, you have the area of interest, or AOY. It encompasses both your AO and AI, but it extends even further, kind of like ripples on a pond.
Okay, so it's getting bigger and bigger.
Exactly. And it includes any area that, could potentially impact your mission, even if it's not an immediate threat. So you're thinking about long-term implications, gathering intelligence, trying to anticipate potential problems down the
It's
road.
like you're looking at the entire chessboard, even if you're only moving one piece at a time.
Perfect analogy. And speaking of chess, let's talk about combined arms, because this is where things get really interesting.
Combined arms. Now, to me, that's always been like the ultimate force multiplier. You take all the different pieces of the military puzzle.
Infantry, armor, artillery, aviation.
Exactly. Each one has its strengths and weaknesses, but you put them together and boom, you get this amazing synergistic effect.
1+1 = 3, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And it's not just about throwing everything at the enemy at once. It's about using each element at the right time, in the right place, to create this kind of, I don't know, symphony of destruction.
I like it. Okay, so within this larger combined arms fight, we have the concept of the engagement area.
Engagement area. Yeah, this is where you decide to make your stand.
About picking your battles, right?
Exactly. You want to establish an engagement area where you can maximize your own firepower and minimize theirs. You're basically maneuvering them into a position where they have no good options.
They're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly.
And to really make matters worse for them, you try to hit them on their flanks.
Flanks and assailable flanks, two key concepts that have been around since people started fighting in formations.
The classics never die.
Right. So your flanks, those are your sides, right? And an assailable flank, that's one that's particularly vulnerable. Maybe it's poorly defended. Maybe the terrain makes it tough to secure. It's an opportunity
An opportunity to exploit.
to get around the enemy's defenses and hit them where they least expect it.
Classic flanking maneuver. And of course, you need to be thinking about that defensively as well, right?
100%. Protect your own flanks. Don't let the enemy do to you what you want to do to them, right?
Right. And this all ties into mutual support, I'm guessing.
Hmm.
The idea that you don't want your units so spread out that they can't help each other.
Exactly. Units need to be positioned to support each other. And that's where supporting distance and supporting range, these concepts become super important.
Okay, so supporting distance, that's pretty straightforward, right?
It's how quickly one unit can get to another unit that needs help.
Okay, so if one platoon is pinned down, how fast can another platoon get there to reinforce them?
Exactly. Supporting range is similar, but it's about the effective range of your weapons systems. You want to be close enough to provide fire support, but not so close that you're all vulnerable to the same attack.
So there's a balance there.
Mm.
You got to find that sweet spot.
Always. And then, even with the best planning in the world, things happen. The enemy does something unexpected, the situation changes. That's why you always keep a reserve.
You're ace in the hole.
Exactly. That portion of your force that you hold back, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice to exploit an opportunity or counter a threat.
So the reserve, it's not just about sitting around waiting for something to happen. It's about
It's about flexibility,
Right.
being able to adapt to the changing circumstances of the battlefield.
always be ready to adjust.
Always. But in the heat of battle, we got to remember the rules we fight by. We're not barbarians.
Right, the rules of engagement, the ROE.
These aren't suggestions, they're directives, orders that dictate when, where, and how we can use force.
So things like what constitutes a hostile act, when you can and can't fire your weapon.
Exactly. And it can get really, really complicated depending on the mission.
So it's crucial to know those ROEs like the back of your hand,
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, we have to be able to justify our
both
actions.
legally and morally.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the overall goals, the warfighting functions, some of the key tactical concepts. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how we actually move on the battlefield.
Let's talk tactics.
Let's talk about the 5 forms of maneuver that form the foundation of offensive operations. Envelopment, frontal assault, infiltration, penetration, and the turning movement.
Classic offensive maneuvers. Tried and true.
Let's start with envelopment. Now, for those who don't know, that's essentially flanking the enemy, right?
It's a classic flanking maneuver designed to fix the enemy in place while a separate force swings around to attack their flank or rear.
Hit them where they least expect it.
Ideally, catching them off guard and sending them running. Classic example. Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville. Textbook envelopment.
Love it. So that's envelopment. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the frontal assault, which is pretty much what it sounds like, right?
It's the no frills, we're coming straight at you approach. Hit them head on with overwhelming force and break through their defenses. It's not subtle, but hey, sometimes you just got to go through the front door.
Brute force.
Exactly. Now, it has its place, obviously, but it's often used in conjunction with other forms of maneuver, like that envelopment we were just talking about, to maximize its effectiveness. Keep them guessing.
Right, because if they know you're coming straight at them, they can plan for it.
Exactly.
So we've got the in-your-face approach, and we've got the flanking approach. Now, what about infiltration? That's all about stealth, right?
Absolutely. Small units slipping through enemy lines, under the cover of darkness, disguised. They're going after critical targets behind enemy lines, command posts, supply depots, communications centers.
Sabotage, basically.
In a nutshell, yeah. It's about sowing chaos and undermining the enemy's ability to function effectively.
Love it. Now, penetration, it's like infiltration's big brother, right?
Exactly. Instead of sneaking through, you're punching a hole right through the enemy's lines with concentrated force. The goal is to shatter their defenses and exploit that breakthrough to drive deep into their rear area.
So you're not just trying to get behind them, you're trying to break them completely.
Break their will to fight.
Okay, last but not least, the turning movement. What is that all about?
The turning movement, it's all about avoiding a direct confrontation with the enemy's main force. Instead of hitting them head-on, you're maneuvering around them, forcing them to either retreat or turn and fight on your terms.
You're dictating the terms of the engagement.
Exactly.
So those are the 5 forms of maneuver. But of course, warfare is not always about attacking. Sometimes you have to defend. In ADP 390, it outlines 3 main forms of defense: perimeter defense, defense of a linear obstacle, and reverse slope defense.
And these aren't just about, hunkering down and waiting for the enemy to attack.
Right, it's not passive.
Not at all. These are active forms of defense. You're using the terrain, firepower, maneuver, all of it, to create this layered defense that makes it as difficult as possible for the enemy to succeed.
Okay, so let's break down each of these defensive forms, starting with perimeter defense. What does that typically look like?
Pretty much what it sounds like. You're defending in all directions. You're establishing defensive positions in a 360-degree perimeter around a key location. Could be a base, a town, a strategically important crossroads, whatever it is, you're protecting it from all sides.
Makes sense. What about defense of a linear obstacle? First of all, what constitutes a linear obstacle?
A linear obstacle could be a river, a ridgeline, a dense forest, basically anything that creates a natural obstacle to movement. Or it could be man-made, like a trench line, a wall, something like that.
And the idea is to funnel the enemy into these predictable avenues of approach.
Exactly. You're using that obstacle to your advantage, channeling them into killing zones where you can concentrate your firepower and inflict maximum casualties.
Smart. Now, what about the last one? Reverse slope defense. What's that all about?
So picture a hill. With a reverse slope defense, you're positioning your main defensive line on the back slope of that hill, shielding them from direct fire and observation.
So they're hidden, basically.
Exactly. The enemy, they come over the crest of that hill thinking it's clear, and boom, they walk right into a wall of lead. It's a great way to spring a surprise on the enemy.
Use the element of surprise. I like
Yeah.
it. So we've talked about how to attack, how to defend, but who's actually doing all this fighting? Let's take a step back and talk about the hierarchical structure of the Army. From that smallest unit, the fire team, all the way up to a field army.
It's a pyramid structure. with each layer building on the one below it.
And it all starts with the fire team, which is often considered the basic maneuver element of the Army.
Right. You've got your fire team, usually 4 soldiers or less, led by a team leader who's usually a corporal or a sergeant. These guys, they train together, they fight together, they're incredibly tight-knit.
A band of brothers.
Exactly. And then a couple of fire teams, they make up a squad.
Right, so you're starting to get a little bit bigger now.
Right. And the squad, it's led by a squad leader, typically a staff sergeant. They're responsible for the actions and well-being of their squad, making sure those fire teams are working together.
And then you take several squads, and you've got yourself a platoon, which is typically where we see a lieutenant taking charge.
Exactly. A platoon, it's usually around 30 to 50 soldiers, give or take.
So that lieutenant has their work cut out for them.
They do. But they're not alone. They've also got a platoon sergeant, who's usually a sergeant first class, to help them out. It's a team effort.
Teamwork makes the dream work,
Yeah,
right?
something like that.
Okay, so moving up the chain, several platoons make up a company.
Exactly. You've got it. A company, it's usually around 100 to 200 soldiers, commanded by a captain.
And then several companies make a battalion.
You got it. A battalion's got 300 to 1,000 soldiers, commanded by a lieutenant colonel.
Getting up there, and then a bunch of battalions make a brigade.
Right, and we're talking 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers here. That's a lot of firepower. And the brigade's typically commanded by a colonel.
And you mentioned the brigade combat team earlier, the BCT.
Right, right. Those BCTs, they've become really important in recent years. They're designed to be these self-contained, combined arms units. So you've got your infantry, your armor, your artillery, all in one package, ready to deploy and fight on a moment's notice.
They're like mini armies.
Pretty much. Then, going up even further, we've got the division.
And this is where you're talking about some serious military muscle.
Oh, yeah. We're talking 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers, commanded by a major general.
And at the top of the heap, you have the Corps.
A corps is massive. We're talking multiple divisions here, typically 2 to 5, sometimes more.
Tens of thousands of soldiers.
At least. And a corps is commanded by a lieutenant general. And then, of course, you have the field army, which is when you're talking about multiple corps coming together for a single operation.
Which is just mind-boggling to think about.
It's rare that you'd ever see an entire field army deployed for a single operation these days, though.
It would have to be something big.
World War Z big. But it's important to remember that even though we've been talking about these echelons in a kind of linear way, you know, from fire team all the way up to field army, modern warfare, it's anything but linear.
Right, it's messy, it's chaotic.
Exactly. So these echelons, they have to be able to work together seamlessly, leveraging each other's strengths to achieve the commander's intent.
It's a team effort at the end of the day.
Always.
It really is something else when you think about it.
It is. It's amazing.
From a fire team of 4 guys.
To a field army of hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. It really makes you appreciate the scope and scale of what we do.
Absolutely. And it kind of underscores why I think ADP 390 is so much more than just, you know, some dry doctrine manual sitting on a shelf.
Right. It's not just something to be studied for a test.
No, it's the blueprint.
Yeah.
It's the blueprint for how we make this incredibly complex organization function.
Right. Because it's easy to get lost in the weeds, you know, to get so focused on your little piece of the puzzle that you lose sight of the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And that's what I hope, you know, our listeners are taking away from this deep dive.
Totally.
This isn't about memorizing definitions. It's about internalizing these concepts, understanding how they apply, you know, in the real world.
And using that knowledge
to make good decisions, whether you're, you know, leading a fire team or you're a general planning a campaign.
Because the battlefield, it doesn't care about your rank.
It does not. It doesn't care how many badges you have.
It's about being adaptable. It's about being a student of your craft, constantly learning, constantly evolving, because the enemy sure as hell is.
Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself. ADP 390, it gives you that solid foundation, that common ground that we can all work from, you know?
That shared understanding.
Exactly.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here on ADP 390, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take with them? Maybe even something they can, you know, put into practice today.
You know, I think it goes back to that idea of adaptability we were just talking about.
Okay, so stay flexible.
Stay flexible. The world is full of unknowns, and the battlefield, man, it's like the ultimate unknown, right? But if you understand the fundamentals, those principles of joint operations, the warfighting functions, even those tactical concepts we talked about, if you've got a solid grasp of that stuff, you'll be surprised what you can overcome.
It's about being a thinking soldier,
Yeah.
not just reacting,
Mm-hmm.
but actually shaping the battle,
Yeah.
taking control.
Exactly. And don't just, finish this deep dive and forget about it. Go
Yeah.
back. Reread those sections of ADP 390 that resonated with you. Think about how you can apply these concepts in your own training.
Absolutely.
The next time you're planning a mission or even just out on patrol.
Because at the end of the day, the more you know, the better off you'll be, right?
Right.
The more effective you'll be as a soldier, as a leader, as a defender.
Couldn't agree more.
Well said. Well, hey, thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. It's been fantastic picking your brain.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Always happy to talk shop.
And for our listeners, until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep learning.